welcome everyone. It's really lovely to see everyone. So today we're going to talk about the bills that passed last session to make sure that you are all up to date on Maryland's new laws as you're working with survivors. I know many of you know bits and pieces of this, but this is everything in one place. And then at the end, we'll chat a little bit about what to expect for next year. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen from a different location. Give me a moment here. All right, so again, this is the 2022 legislation, and this is things that affect survivors of sexual violence and family violence. You're listening to a presentation by the Maryland Coalition Against Sexual Assault, and this is my email address. And I especially wanted this group to know and really take seriously my invitation to email me if you have questions about the laws, if you have questions about legislation, but most importantly, if you have ideas for things that could help you serve survivors, you're running into a problem with one of the statutes, you think that something's not addressed, please let us know. Some of the best ideas for Maryland's laws come from the field. We're talking about laws that were passed in Annapolis. So these are state laws, not the federal laws. We're going to talk first about bills that passed. First, and perhaps for some of us, the very important issue of VOCA funding. So this is federal funding that comes to the state. There was an enormous gap in between what had been allocated to the state of Maryland and what had traditionally been expended in the field. VOCA is for rape crisis and sexual assault survivors, but also domestic violence, human trafficking, child advocacy centers, child abuse services, families of murder victims, victim witness assistance in state's attorney's offices, and more. Governor Hogan and the legislature fixed the VOCA funding gap beginning in October 2022 with a one-year fix. So this is something we need to address again. But for the time being, we've got over 120 Maryland services survivors supported by this funding. And the legislature said that you have to keep this funding level. There was still a gap, and the governor and the administration came through to fill this. Again, though, this is just a one-year fix, and this is something that really is something the governor and that administration has to address as well. So we're going to need more advocacy this upcoming session in January of 2023 and with our new governor, Wes Moore. In terms of non-money bills, so policy bills, we have a law that creates a new definition of stalking. And so it adds tracking without consent. For example, putting stalkerware on someone's phone, putting a GPS device on someone's car. And this was very important because previously the stalking statute really required physical presence, and we needed to change that. So by changing the definition of stalking, it really has an effect in two different places. It improves our criminal stalking law, but it also really expands the peace and protective orders that can be issued based on stalking. Another protective order law that passed is a bill that permits, it doesn't mandate, but it permits remote access for temporary protective orders. Now, this is beginning to be implemented across the state, and what we can really say about it is it's different everywhere. So one of the things you should know is that many of you are now working at programs where your program could help be the place where survivors come and they ask for remote access to get their temporary protective order. Hospitals can also do this. Courts can also just designate a place. Certainly from MCASA's point of view, we really are concerned that we have good widespread access to temporary protective orders and testify that places like libraries would be a good place to have this sort of access, because when you're in danger, the last thing we want to do is put another barrier in front of you when you're trying to find safety and seek a protective order. You have to call the clerk's office. There's no way around it. Everybody is handling it slightly differently. So be sure you know what's going on in the jurisdiction where you work. A third bill on protective orders is a bill about what's called merger. This is a pretty technical bill, but you may have run across it if you're advocating for a survivor in a criminal case. I know a few of you really work a great deal in the criminal justice system. So this was important because previously you could get a conviction, an assailant could get a conviction for assault if they had assaulted a survivor, or they could get a conviction for violating a protective order. But if they were convicted of both, the law works in the way that if there's not an explicit directive otherwise, you have to impose the lower sentence. So assault has a sentence of up to 10 years, but violating a protective order, first conviction is 90 days. So we had situations where people were actually getting a lower sentence when they committed an assault in violation of a protective order. This bill fixes that. So now you're allowed to get a conviction both for assault and for violation of a protective order. Moving on to rape kits and sexual assault forensic exams, we have a lot of people who are working on SART teams, and I know you spend a lot of time discussing this, and really want to thank you for your work and tell you about some of the things that will support your work. One of the things is that we have new regulations about reimbursement for sexual assault forensic exams that are expected to be published soon. We'll let you know through the MCASA communications and emails and things when that is published so people can make comments. But in particular, Laura Jessic and her team have really worked very hard with the Maryland Hospital Association and the Governor's Office of Crime Control and Prevention to make sure that these new regulations really address some of the very, very dated mandates in the prior regulations. There was another bill, and what that did is we have a law in Maryland that has the really radical notion that we should prevent HIV infection for rape survivors. So the legislator created a pilot program. They said, look, let's try this for 3 years, because there was a lot of concern that this would cost way too much money and we should not do this. As it turned out, it's something that the state of Maryland can easily handle. Really somewhat disappointing that they were so focused on the cost to the state when this is such a serious issue for survivors, but they've seen the light and they lifted the pilot program, and now this is a permanent part of Maryland's law that we provide medicine to prevent HIV for rape survivors. We also put some money towards the issue of rape kits and testing, and so $3.5 million was included in the budget to address rape kits. Moving on to our next issue is the issue of abortion access. So abortion access is really critical for survivors, right? Because rape survivors, about 5% become pregnant from rape, and almost 3 million women in the US have experienced rape-related pregnancy. So having access to reproductive care is critically important. We made progress in Maryland to making sure that there is solid abortion access. One of the most important things we did is we are allowing advanced practice healthcare providers to provide abortions. They could already prescribe medical abortions, so prescribe the pills that will abort a fetus, but this will also allow the procedural abortions. They also mandated funding for training because we want to make sure that those advanced practice healthcare providers are top-notch in giving women and others who are pregnant the best possible care. Governor Hogan absolutely refused to do that during his administration, so that was delayed. But the funding will be mandated next year, and we're hopeful that Governor Moore may even release some of those funds prior to the start of the next fiscal year on July 1st. There's also now stronger support for Medicaid abortions to ensure that people have access to abortions even if they can't afford them. And this issue of abortion access, you'll learn, is something that we're going to look at again the next session. In the realm of evidence law, we expanded what's referred to as the tender years law. And so that's the law that says, if a child says to someone, this is what happened to me about abuse, then that someone can tell the jury, this is what the child said. Normally, that would be prohibited by hearsay rules, but there are exceptions. And this doesn't mean that the child doesn't have to testify. The child does still have to testify, but now you also have a social worker, a doctor, a police officer, maybe someone at the Child Advocacy Center who can also say, and the child told me this in this professional setting. It's not for everybody. It's not the statement to someone's mom or to someone's sister. It's to professionals. This is now expanded to people who are witnesses of what's called a crime of violence, which is a very technical term, and they're under the age of 13. This is a huge expansion of this rule. It is super technical, so I really encourage you to make sure that folks in your community are receiving the training that they need. I think for advocates who are not in the courtroom, this is making sure that you're documenting what's being said, that you're aware of this possibility. And for the trial attorneys in the crowd, this is new hearsay development. It's an expansion of an old rule, but a rule that a lot of us didn't have a lot of experience with because it used to be so much more narrow. Another bill passed on terminating leases for survivors. And so what this does is it allows survivors of abuse a greater ability to terminate a lease. It expanded the definition of those survivors to use abuse as we use it in the protective order statute. So that's something that the people on this call are familiar with. It includes survivors of sexual assault, of child sexual abuse, of domestic violence, of stalking, of child abuse, of elder abuse. This is most elder abuse. This is really a big deal in terms of the scope of the coverage of the law to allow termination of leases. As importantly, instead of saying you have to have a court document, you now have a list of third parties who can certify that the abuse occurred. And that's many of you on this call, right? Because this includes certification by advocates at rape crisis and domestic violence programs. So you'll be able to confirm that, yes, this person is a survivor of abuse and get them out of the lease. And you know, this can be so important for physical safety, but also for economic security. In the human trafficking arena, there was a bill that passed on prevention and identification, and I would say evidence. And what it will do is it requires what's referred to as innkeepers, which is a very old-fashioned term that really covers hotels, motels. And they're going to be required to maintain guest records and to provide employees with human trafficking awareness training. Those guest records are what I anticipate will be evidence in cases. So this is really something that will help us in the courts as well. Those are some of the bills that passed. I think those are all important for you all to know about, but let me also tell you about some of the bills that failed that we really think are going to come back next session and hopefully be a little bit more successful. One is marriage as a defense to sex crimes. And sad to say that in Maryland, marriage is still a defense to some sex crimes. Not to all sex crimes, but to many sex crimes. This failed on the very last day of session, so what's referred to as sine die. That's not sign or die, but effectively that's pretty much what it means. If it doesn't pass on that day, it's not a valid bill until it's reintroduced the next session. So we're going to keep working on that. A bill on human trafficking to keep youth victims out of the criminal justice system similarly failed on that last day of session. So this is what's referred to as the Safe Harbor Bill. And the Safe Harbor Bill addresses minors who are survivors of sex trafficking or human trafficking, and they're fairly low-level crimes. So it's immunity. It says you can't be prosecuted. So it's complete immunity, but it's not for things like murder, right? And so it will assist in many, many cases. And they've really found that so many survivors of trafficking occasionally, maybe a few will be picked up for prostitution, but most of them are getting picked up for things like joyriding, so taking somebody else's car and riding around, drug possession, some of those more minor issues. A bill that did not pass that we are expecting to come back is on crime victims' rights. And this one is on body cameras and victim privacy. Body cameras, of course, have been just an invaluable tool in addressing police accountability and helping to address systemic racism and some of the other issues that we've encountered within our law enforcement community. They really help everybody with transparency and accountability, but they also sometimes capture victims and survivors in some of the most difficult moments, they're coming to the door when they were just assaulted or something like that. So we want to make sure that that footage is not on the internet, not passed around amongst friends, but is really kept private. So those are some bills that were introduced that failed. We expect to come back. I'll give you a couple of the new bills that we expect. One I alluded to before, and that's stronger abortion access. So there will be at least 3 bills addressing abortion access. One of them will be to add and embed reproductive freedom within Maryland's Constitution. That's a longer process than just passing a bill, but that's something that we are hoping will pass this year. It's the Speaker's bill, and we're very appreciative that she had that introduced, or she will be introducing that. Another bill is on privacy. So this is data privacy. There are unfortunately too many cases where we've seen doctors, other medical professionals are now on commercial applications that share information about different patients. And so there was, as an example, a woman in Texas, she became pregnant, she left, she obtained an abortion in California. Her doctor in Texas knew about what she was doing because of this application. So we want to make sure that the data that is collected in Maryland about these sensitive issues stays in Maryland and stays within the survivor's control. And then finally, something that I think is really important for all of you is on liability. So we want to make sure that if you help someone obtain an abortion, say you're talking to a rape survivor in a state where abortion is prohibited and people don't have the right to choose, and you advise them about what's available in Maryland, we want to make sure that you are not sued, that your records cannot be subpoenaed, that you are not held criminally liable. So all of those 3 bills we're expecting. We're expecting to have a bill to define consent in the state of Maryland. So in Maryland, consent is something that's defined through case law, not through statute, but we are going to try to fix that and make it a little more clear that the only person who can consent to touching you in a sexual way is you. And then finally, there will be a bill to try to stabilize some of the VOCA issues that we've seen in the past. Those are 3 bills that we anticipate. There will be hundreds more. So please, participate in our listserv. Make sure that you're in contact with others who are advocating on these issues. It's really important to have your voices in Annapolis. If you want more information, you can always look on our website under the Law and Public Policy tab. You can sign up for our alerts. And every year I ask you to do 3 things. So every year I would say you should make 3 phone calls, 3 emails, 2 phone calls, an email, a text, an email, a phone call, whatever you'd like. But please reach out to Annapolis and let those lawmakers know what's important to the survivors that you work with. It really does make a difference when you all are making phone calls, when I walk in as your lobbyist and I say, hey, we really need to pass this bill. People say to me, you know what, I've been getting phone calls. This is important to sexual assault survivors. This was an election year, so lots of things are changing in Annapolis at the governor's level, at the attorney general's level, at the General Assembly, at the comptroller's office. So we'll have lots of new people. And remember that if you are working in your community, some of your elected officials might be new. And part of what you can do is educate them about the policy needs of survivors. Don't lobby unless you're permitted to lobby. Never use grant funds to lobby. Be very careful about all of that. But you absolutely can tell people what survivors need and what policies are helpful. So with that, I'm just going to encourage everybody to speak up, speak out. I'm going to remind you one more time that our legislative reception is coming on January 19th and hope to see many of you there. With that, we're going to stop the recording so we can speak freely and ask some questions. But I do want to just take a moment and say thank you to everybody for the work that you do. It's absolutely tremendous. And I think the past few years have been extremely difficult for all of us, and that you've chosen to continue to work for survivors really speaks volumes about your character and your commitment and your just commitment to ending sexual violence. So thank you for all of that. All right.